My girlfriend said, "Your rich friend wants me. I'm choosing financial security." I replied, "Smart business move." Then I told my friend she'd been bragging about using him for money while texting her ex. His security cameras caught her stealing jewelry to fund her double life. Now, she is facing criminal charges. I, 31M, thought I knew the woman I'd been dating for 2 years. Turns out, I didn't know her at all. It started 3 months ago when she brought up my friend Jake during one of our usual dinner conversations. She mentioned how successful he was, how impressive his new house looked, how nice his car was. I didn't think much of it initially. Jake had done well for himself in tech, and most people noticed his lifestyle upgrade. But then she kept bringing him up. Every time we hung out with our friend group, she'd find ways to position herself near him. She'd laugh a little too hard at his jokes, ask detailed questions about his work, compliment his watch or whatever expensive thing he was wearing that day. Jake and I had been friends since college. He was the guy who'd lend you his last $20 or help you move apartments on a weekend. Money hadn't changed his core personality, but it had definitely changed how some people treated him. I'd watched several acquaintances suddenly become very interested in his friendship once his startup took off. I started noticing the signs with her too. The way she'd dress up more when she knew Jake would be around. How she'd mention needing new things, a laptop for her freelance work, car repairs, her student loan payments. Usually right after we'd spent time with him. 3 weeks ago, everything came to a head. We were sitting in my apartment after dinner when she brought up Jake again, but this time it was different. She wasn't being subtle anymore. She told me directly that Jake had been showing interest in her, that he'd been texting her, asking her to grab coffee, making it clear he was attracted to her. She said she'd been thinking about it seriously because, frankly, she needed financial security that I couldn't provide. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, but I kept my expression neutral. She explained that she wasn't getting any younger, that she needed to think practically about her future. Jake could offer her things I couldn't: a nice house, financial stability, the ability to quit her stressful job and focus on her art. She said she cared about me, but caring didn't pay bills or build a secure future. She'd made her decision to pursue things with Jake, and she wanted to be honest with me about it. I looked at her sitting there, calmly explaining how she was trading up for me like I was an old car she'd outgrown. The cold calculation in her voice was something I'd never heard before. This wasn't a woman torn between 2 men she cared about. This was someone making a business decision. I told her I appreciated her honesty and that it sounded like a smart business move. She seemed surprised that I was taking it so well, probably expecting tears or anger or begging. Instead, I congratulated her on thinking strategically about her future. She left that night, and I sat alone in my apartment processing what had just happened. 2 years together, and she'd just informed me she was moving on to someone who could better fund her lifestyle. But here's the thing, I knew Jake really well. And I knew he wasn't the type to pursue someone's girlfriend, especially not mine. So either she was lying about his interest to make herself feel better about her decision, or something else was going on. I decided to text Jake the next morning. I told him we needed to talk, and asked if he wanted to grab lunch. When we met up, I could tell something was bothering him before I even brought up the situation. He told me he'd been meaning to reach out because something weird had been happening. She'd been texting him frequently over the past few weeks, way more than normal. At first, it seemed friendly, asking about his work, making conversation. But then the messages got more personal. She'd started complaining about money stress, mentioning how hard it was to make ends meet as a freelancer. She'd send photos of herself at art galleries or restaurants, usually with captions about wishing she could afford nice things more often. The messages had an undertone that made him uncomfortable, like she was fishing for him to offer help or make some kind of move. Jake said he'd been mostly ignoring the hints because he wasn't interested and because she was my girlfriend. But recently, she'd gotten more direct, suggesting they meet up alone and making comments about how she appreciated successful, ambitious men. I told Jake about our conversation the night before, about how she'd claimed he was pursuing her. His face went through several expressions: confusion, then understanding, then anger. He said she'd been playing some kind of game, making it seem like he was interested while actually being the one pushing for something to happen. She'd probably been planning to tell him I was okay with them exploring things, or maybe that we'd broken up. We talked for another hour, piecing together her strategy. She'd been positioning herself as available while making it seem like the interest was coming from his side. Classic manipulation. creating a situation where he'd feel like he was the one making a move while she was just responding to his advances. Jake was pretty angry about being used in her scheme. He said he'd noticed other things too, how she'd ask detailed questions about his house, his investments, his travel plans. Questions that seemed like genuine interest at the time, but now felt like someone gathering intelligence. That's when he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He said she'd been to his house a few times when our friend group hung out there, and he'd noticed she had a habit of wandering around, checking out different rooms under the guise of admiring his place. He'd installed a comprehensive security system after moving in, cameras throughout the house, motion sensors, the works. It was partly for security and partly because he was fascinated by the technology. He pulled up the app on his phone and started scrolling through recent footage. What we found was worse than either of us had expected. The cameras showed her on multiple occasions slipping small items into her purse when she thought no one was looking. An expensive pen from his office, a small decorative sculpture from his living room, some cufflinks from his bedroom dresser. Items small enough that their absence wouldn't be immediately noticed, but valuable enough to be worth something. But the most damning footage was from 2 weeks ago. The camera in his home office caught her going through his desk drawers, photographing financial documents with her phone. Bank statements, investment portfolios, tax information. She wasn't just stealing objects, she was stealing information. Jake's face was grim as we watched the footage. This wasn't opportunistic theft, this was systematic intelligence gathering. She'd been building a profile of his finances, probably to better position herself as the perfect companion for his lifestyle. We scrolled through more footage and found evidence of her taking jewelry from his bedroom, expensive pieces that had belonged to his grandmother, items with serious sentimental value, not just monetary worth. I felt sick watching it all. This woman I'd shared a bed with, introduced to my family, talked about a future with, she'd been running a con game on my best friend while using our relationship as cover. Jake wanted to call the police immediately, but I asked him to wait. I had an idea that would be more satisfying than just having her arrested, though that was definitely going to happen too. I texted her that evening, asking if she wanted to come over to pick up some things she'd left at my place. She agreed, probably thinking this was going to be some kind of closure conversation, or maybe hoping to explain more about her decision. When she arrived, she was dressed nicely, probably an outfit intended to remind me what I was losing. She seemed almost cheerful, like she was relieved to have everything out in the open. She started talking about how this was probably for the best, how we could remain friends, how she hoped I understood her position. I let her talk while I set up my phone to record. Then I told her I'd been thinking about our conversation, and I had some questions about her relationship with Jake. I asked her to tell me more about how his pursuit of her had developed. She launched into this elaborate story about how Jake had been flirting with her for months, how he'd been dropping hints about his attraction to her, how he'd finally worked up the courage to suggest they spend time together without me around. She painted herself as the reluctant party, someone who'd tried to discourage his advances but eventually realized they had a genuine connection. She said Jake had told her he'd always found her more interesting than the other women in our friend group, that he appreciated her intelligence and ambition. The lies flowed so easily that I realized this wasn't impulsive deception. She'd been crafting this narrative for weeks, probably practicing it until it sounded believable. I asked her what she thought Jake's financial situation was really like, just to see how much research she'd done. She gave me a surprisingly detailed breakdown of his assets, his business ventures, even some information about his family's wealth that I didn't think was public knowledge. When I asked where she'd learned all these details, she said Jake had shared them during their conversations, that he was excited to have someone who understood his ambitions. I nodded along like this all made perfect sense, then asked if she thought Jake would be upset to learn she was still texting her ex-boyfriend from college. Her face went completely still. I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how I could possibly know about that. I told her I'd found out about her ongoing relationship with her ex, the one she'd claimed was completely over when we started dating, the one she'd been sending money to for months, telling him she was working on a plan to improve their financial situation. I'd actually discovered this completely by accident the week before, when she'd left her laptop open at my place and a message notification popped up. When I saw his name, I was curious enough to look at their conversation history. What I found was months of messages about their relationship, about how she missed him, about how she was going to find a way to get enough money for them to start fresh somewhere else. She'd been telling him about her plan to get close to Jake, about how she was confident she could convince him to help her financially or even start a relationship with her. She described me as a temporary placeholder while she worked on securing a better situation. The messages revealed that everything about our relationship had been fake from the beginning. She targeted me specifically because I was friends with Jake. I was never the goal. I was just the pathway to the real target. Her face went pale as I described what I'd found. She started to stammer some explanation, but I held up my hand. I told her the most interesting part wasn't even her plan to manipulate Jake. It was the photos she'd been sending her ex showing off expensive jewelry and electronics she definitely couldn't afford on her freelance income. I described items I'd seen in the photos that I now knew belonged to Jake. Items she'd been stealing from his house and bragging about to her ex, probably selling some of them to fund their relationship. She was no longer the confident woman who'd walked into my apartment. She looked cornered, desperate, like she was trying to figure out how much I actually knew versus how much I was guessing. I told her I had one more question. Did she really think Jake's security cameras wouldn't catch her going through his house stealing things? That's when she broke down completely. The sophisticated mask slipped away, and I saw who she really was. Someone who'd been running scams and manipulating people probably her entire adult life. She tried to explain that she'd never meant for things to go this far, that she'd gotten in over her head, that she really did care about me and hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. I listened to her excuses for about 10 minutes, then told her she had two choices. She could call Jake and confess everything, returning whatever she hadn't already sold and hoping he'd be merciful about pressing charges. Or she could leave my apartment right now and deal with the police when they showed up at her door with a warrant. She begged me not to involve the police, promised to make everything right, said she'd disappear from our lives completely if I'd just give her a chance to fix things. I told her the time for fixing things had passed when she decided to steal from my friend while running a con game on both of us. The police were getting called either way. The only question was whether she wanted to show some remorse first. She chose to leave without confessing, probably hoping she could spin some version of events that would minimize her culpability. I called Jake as soon as she left, and we called the police together. The security footage provided clear evidence of theft, and my recorded conversation with her showed premeditation and an ongoing pattern of deception. Update 1. The police took the case seriously once they saw the evidence. Multiple instances of theft caught on camera, plus the financial documents she'd photographed, constituted several felonies. She was arrested 3 days later. Her bail was set high enough that she couldn't afford it, which meant she had to sit in jail while the case developed. Her ex-boyfriend was apparently shocked to learn about her arrest. According to the police, he'd been receiving money from her for months, but claimed he didn't know where it was coming from. Whether he was telling the truth or just protecting himself, I don't know. Jake ended up getting most of his stolen items back, though some of the jewelry had already been sold. The pawn shop records helped establish the timeline and scope of her thefts. The most interesting development came when the police searched her apartment and found detailed notes about several other people in our social circle, their jobs, their apparent financial situations, their relationship statuses. She'd been running background research on multiple targets, not just Jake. One of our mutual friends came forward after hearing about the arrest and said she'd been asking him detailed questions about his new promotion and his living situation. Another friend mentioned that some expensive items had gone missing from his apartment after parties she'd attended, but he'd never suspected her specifically. It turned out she'd been working her way through our entire friend group, identifying the best targets and developing strategies for each one. I was just the key that opened the door to Jake, who was clearly the biggest prize. Update 2. Her court date was last week. She ended up pleading guilty to multiple felony theft charges and one count of identity theft related to photographing Jake's financial documents. The prosecutor said she'd been running similar schemes for years, moving from city to city and friend group to friend group. There were outstanding warrants in 2 other states for similar crimes. Jake decided not to pursue the civil case once it became clear she had no assets to recover anyway. The court-ordered restitution would probably never be paid, but at least she was facing real consequences. She got 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. Her lawyer tried to argue for a lighter sentence based on her claim that she'd been struggling financially and had made desperate choices, but the judge wasn't swayed by the sob story. I testified about the manipulation and deception, focusing on how she'd systematically built trust with our friend group to gain access to their homes and personal information. The judge seemed particularly disturbed by the calculated nature of her actions. During the sentencing, she finally showed what might have been genuine remorse, talking about how she'd lost sight of who she was and had hurt people who trusted her. But it was hard to believe anything she said after months of lies. Her ex-boyfriend was also charged as an accessory after the police found evidence that he'd known at least some of the money was coming from theft. He took a plea deal for a lesser charge. Update 3. It's been 6 months since everything came out, and life has mostly returned to normal. Jake upgraded his security system and is more careful about who he invites to his house, but he's not letting the experience make him paranoid or suspicious of everyone. Our friend group was shaken by how completely she'd fooled all of us, but it's also brought us closer together. We're more protective of each other now, more aware of the signs that someone might be running a game. I've started dating again, though I'll admit I'm more cautious about people's motivations now. The experience taught me to pay attention to patterns of behavior rather than just accepting people's explanations for things. The hardest part wasn't even the betrayal. It was realizing how completely I'd misread someone I thought I knew well. She'd been performing the role of caring girlfriend while systematically planning to exploit my friendships. But there's something satisfying about knowing that her smart business move ended up costing her everything. She chose financial security over genuine relationships and ended up with neither money nor freedom. Jake and I are closer than ever. Going through something like this together, discovering the deception, working with the police, supporting each other through the legal process, it creates a bond that's hard to break. I still think about her sometimes, wondering how many other people she'd manipulated over the years, how many relationships she'd destroyed in pursuit of easy money. But mostly I'm grateful that we found out when we did, before she could do even more damage. The whole experience reinforced something I'd always believed, but maybe hadn't fully appreciated: that real relationships are built on trust and genuine care, not strategic calculations about what someone can provide for you. She thought she was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. But in the end, her elaborate schemes just led her to prison, while the people she'd tried to exploit moved on with their lives. Sometimes the smartest business move is just being honest.